Okay, let's forget everything you think you know about traditional naval warfare for just a second. Wipe away the images of massive cannons and huge dramatic explosions. Because today in this explainer, we are unpacking a 2019 deployment by the Royal Navy's HMS Montrose to the East China Sea. And it is a masterclass in how real, modern, non-kinetic naval power actually works. We're looking at how geopolitical influence is wielded today through stealth, deep strategy, and the incredibly high-stakes game of international rule enforcement. It is just a brilliant window into these quiet, highly secretive operations conducted thousands of miles from home, almost always under the cover of darkness. A British warship was watching the sea, and suddenly it found something it wasn't supposed to see. Just picture that for a moment. You've got this lone frigate operating in the dead of night, slicing through the deep, pitch-black waters of the Indo-Pacific. The crew is just doing their job, observing, running sonar, keeping a really quiet watch on the horizon. And then, out of total blackness, a silhouette emerges that instantly sets off alarm bells. Okay, let's dive into this dark ocean mystery, because this encounter didn't just test the crew of the HMS Montrose, it sent a massive ripple straight through international diplomatic channels. To really wrap our heads around what's at stake here, we have to look at the players on this massive geopolitical chessboard. The East China Sea, it is not just any stretch of ocean. It connects some of the busiest, most major global economies on Earth, like China and Japan. And it directly overlaps with highly sensitive military waters, plus those incredibly strict international sanction zones surrounding the Korean Peninsula. It's this dense, hyper-complex environment where global trade routes just collide. Literally every single ship moving through these waters is tracked and analyzed. So for Britain, putting a warship right here, that was no accident. It was a highly calculated move to support international security alongside their regional partners, dropping right into the thick of one of the world's most closely watched maritime regions. So let's ground ourselves in the timeline. The year is 2019. The entire world was watching the Indo-Pacific really closely, and the United Kingdom made the call to send the HMS Montrose, a highly capable Royal Navy frigate, halfway across the globe. But why 2019 specifically? Well, international bodies were really ramping up the pressure on certain global actors to stick to agreed-upon rules. And let's be honest, words on paper, they only get you so far. You need actual eyes on the water. So Britain, working hand-in-hand with Japanese partners, deployed the Montrose straight into this highly charged environment. But why exactly were they there? Well, it boils down to one major objective: enforcing United Nations sanctions against North Korea. Based on the source material, it's absolutely clear this was not your conventional combat operation. Nobody was out there trying to start a war or provoke some kind of attack. Instead, it was this highly secretive, incredibly methodical effort just to make sure international laws were actually being followed. Those British sailors were essentially acting as the eyes and ears of the UN, scanning the horizon for any subtle, hidden signs that ships might be trying to bypass global restrictions by secretly moving prohibited cargo. Now, what's really interesting about this is the sheer, absolute discipline required by the crew. Their mandate was highly procedural. Step 1, detect unusual activity. Step 2, identify the vessels. And Step 3, document reliable information. It sounds simple, right? Well, actually scratch that, it's incredibly tough. Imagine trying to do this in the middle of the ocean, in the pitch black of night, surrounded by totally legitimate commercial shipping traffic. You're hunting for a needle in a massive haystack, and guess what? The needle is actively trying to hide from you. This meant the crew had to completely suppress any instinct for kinetic military action. They had to rely entirely on deep patience, advanced radar, and flawless operational protocol. Which brings us to the climax of the watch. The Montrose is out there, working alongside Japanese naval vessels, scanning that darkness. And then, an anomaly. So what did they actually spot on the high seas? Out there in the pitch black, miles and miles from any port, the British crew suddenly spots a North Korean flagged vessel. But here's the kicker. It wasn't just sailing through. It was parked, completely stationary, pulled up right next to another ship. On the open ocean, two massive cargo ships linking up like that in the dark, that is a massive glowing red flag. The tension on the bridge of the Montrose must have been absolutely electric at that moment. What the Montrose had just stumbled upon is something known as a ship-to-ship transfer. That's the act of moving cargo between vessels right there at sea, and it is very often utilized to illicitly evade UN sanctions. Think about it. If a country is banned from importing or exporting goods through official, heavily monitored ports, how do they get around it? Well, they take a ship that looks totally legitimate, sail it out into international waters, and then secretly, off the books, pass the cargo over to a sanctioned vessel. It's basically maritime smuggling on a massive industrial scale. And the crew of the HMS Montrose, they had just caught them red-handed. They were looking at a direct, undeniable violation of international law. But here's where the whole thing takes a really fascinating turn. The crew's arsenal, it didn't involve a single weapon. Look at their checklist. Observe the activity, record photographic evidence, and report it to the UN Enforcement Coordination Cell. Notice what's missing? Nobody fired a gun. The British crew did not respond by manning the weapons. Instead, they grabbed cameras. They used long-lens photography and intensive digital intelligence gathering. They meticulously recorded every single thing they saw, basically turning a warship into a floating forensic laboratory. Every photo, every radar blip was quietly compiled and instantly beamed straight to the United Nations. They fought this battle entirely with information. And this brilliantly illustrates the massive shift we're seeing in modern warfare, right? We are moving way beyond traditional naval combat, kinetic confrontation, firing weapons, sinking ships. We're moving into an era of modern naval power that is entirely defined by surveillance, intelligence gathering, and enforcing international law. The HMS Montrose essentially proved that a modern warship's absolute most potent weapon might just be its ability to observe and report. By legally documenting that illicit transfer, they handed the UN the exact, rock-solid evidence needed to enforce those sanctions diplomatically. It's a totally different mindset. It requires incredible restraint, immense technical skill, and just a deep, deep understanding of international law. Now, we need to pause and clarify a really important piece of context here. China was absolutely not the target of this operation. When we talk about military deployments in the East China Sea, it is super easy to jump straight to conclusions about great power competition and geopolitical posturing. But if we look strictly at the facts of this specific mission, it was 100% about enforcing UN sanctions against North Korea. The UK and China were not in conflict here, and this wasn't some antagonistic move against Beijing. It was a strictly defined, internationally backed policing action happening out in international waters. But, just because a nation isn't the direct target doesn't mean the location itself isn't a huge deal. The wider geopolitical impact here is profound. The East China Sea is this incredibly dense web of overlapping military power, massive global trade routes, and deeply complex regional diplomacy. So even when a warship like the Montrose is just sitting there watching North Korean smugglers, its very presence sends a massive strategic message. It shows that outside powers are absolutely willing to deploy real resources to the Indo-Pacific. Every single deployment in this region, even a totally quiet one, acts as a subtle deterrent. It reminds everyone of the international community's reach and resolve. Which brings us to this really profound takeaway. Sometimes the most important military missions happen in complete silence. This 2019 deployment wasn't front-page news, mostly because nothing blew up. But just by watching the sea, collecting evidence, and working with allies, they upheld international law and kept the pressure right where it belonged, on a sanctioned regime. True modern military strength isn't always about the capacity for destruction. A lot of the time, it's about projecting stability and enforcing the rules of the road halfway across the world without ever firing a single shot. So it kind of leaves you wondering, doesn't it? Right now, tonight, what other silent missions are happening out there on the dark oceans to keep the global gears turning?